Hello, everyone. I'm Noam, a PhD student here at the University of Oxford, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar organised by the Doctoral Training Partnership in Environmental Research at the University of Oxford. I'm really pleased to introduce our chair for this evening, Dr. Lucy Woodall. So Lucy is a senior research fellow in marine biology in the zoology department here at Oxford, and she's also principal scientist at Necton. Lucy's work broadly focuses on the processes that drive biodiversity in the marine biome, including the impacts of human activities such as plastic pollution. And her microplastics research was some of the first to reveal the extent of microplastic pollution in the deep sea. She also provides expert opinion for international and national organisations on marine conservation and management, and is a member of many applied working parties, such as the high-level panel expert group for the UN on the sustainable ocean economy. So with that, I will hand over to our chair, Lucy.
Thank you, Noam, and hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. So a few housekeeping points to start with. On this webinar today, we are going to use the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure everyone's done lots of Zoom calls over the last few months, but yeah, just as a reminder, the Q&A is at the bottom of the screen. Next to that, there is a chat function. So if you want to comment on something, then please use the chat function. And of course, as I've seen many of you already, said hello on the chat as well, which is great. But please use the Q&A for your questions. That's where I'll be looking at the end. So this seminar today is going to be navigating choppy waters, and this is explaining a little bit more about the negotiations for the international legal instrument for the conservation and the use of marine and biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. That is a mouthful. So we normally shorten that to the acronym of BBNJ. And when we're talking about the bits of water, we say ABNJ. And this is essentially we use this acronym to encompass the process and this future agreement. So today we're going to hear from three really distinguished speakers with a huge variety of expertise, and they're going to introduce some of their thoughts about this process. And then once they have done that with their presentations, we're going to have a question and answer session. I know I've got some already because I'm really interested in finding out what they've got to think about this process. But importantly, it's really key that we get questions from yourselves as the audience. So please do put those questions in the question and answer box as you come up with them as the presenters are talking. And we do want to make sure that the panel address your area of interest. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview prior to handing over to the panel for their thoughts. And just a reminder that the areas beyond national jurisdiction, that means the high seas, and that is any bit of water that is outside of any national EEZ, exclusive economic zone. There will be lots of acronyms. We'll try and define them. If we don't, ask in the questions. Really important everybody understands as we move through in this narrative, because it's quite complicated. It's been going on for a really long time. So this process started back in 2004 with the creation of a working group. And then in 2012 at the UN conference for sustainable development, which otherwise is known as Rio+20, the states committed themselves to address on an urgent basis the issue of conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity on areas beyond national jurisdiction, this ABNJ. And this included making a decision on the development of international instrument under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, otherwise known as UNCLOS. So there were preparatory communications in 2016 and 2017, and actually I was in New York for some of those. So delighted now to hear about from the experts today about where that process has gone to. And this led to a resolution that was co-sponsored by about 141 different states. Negotiations and intergovernmental conferences were held in 2018 and 2019. And the fourth session for these negotiations was expected in 2020. But we all know what happened in 2020. We haven't really been traveling around so much. So this has delayed this conference. And actually right now there is intersessional communications to take the conversations a little further. So I've told you about the background. So that's kind of the structure of how we're coming to talk today. But let me just give you a quick snapshot of the four main elements. And these are the marine genetic resources. And this aspect is focused specifically on genetic resources from marine species can be assessed and accessed, and how those benefits can be shared in an equitable and a transparent manner. Part two is looking at sort of area-based management tools, and these things include marine protected areas, or MPAs. And this really means trying to understand how to regulate human activity in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, ABNJ, especially in and around ecologically important or vulnerable marine areas. And trying to use an integrated manner, including these spatial management tools, to do that. The third aspect is around environmental impact assessments. And this is looking at the evaluation of the impacts and current and future human activities in the marine environment, and looking at the regulation of those when it's deemed that they should take place. And finally, looking at the capacity building and the transfer of marine technologies. And that's something that I'm personally very interested in. So really delighted that we can have these conversations today as part of the panel. And this really means how to ensure the ability of developing and traditionally disadvantaged states to be able to participate appropriately in the research, the commercial use, and the management of the high seas. This is a really large point. So of course, there are specific aspects of discussion around each point, and I'm not going to summarize them here now. But of course, there are some areas, especially I would say within the marine genetic resources, that require many more discussions to get some agreements. And there's also overarching elements like the institutional structure and the funding of this instrument. So finally, as you might imagine, not everybody is in agreement. So there are some nations really advocating for this process, like the Pacific Island states. Others that have been taking more of a mediating role in this, like maybe Canada. And of course, others that maybe are a little reluctant and not quite sure what it brings for them. So with that introduction now done, I am really pleased to introduce the lovely Professor Kerry Howell. She is a professor of deep sea biology at the School of Biological and Marine Sciences at the University of Plymouth. So she's lucky, she gets to hang out by the ocean. So Kerry's research is focused on understanding the biodiversity patterns in the deep sea. And from an applied perspective, Kerry's research is focused on sustainable management of deep sea ecosystems, particularly in supporting the effective management of marine protected area networks. So this includes the creation of reliable habitat maps and models of population connectivity that underpin these designs. So Kerry, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Lucy, for that warm welcome, and thank you, Noam, for inviting me here today. So I was asked to comment initially on what I see as some of the challenges around management of high seas areas, and I can only speak to that really from my experience of working in this region. in particular with respect to spatial management and marine protected areas. And so I think, to me, some of the biggest problems that we have in the way that we are currently managing the high seas is the disconnects between the different sectors. So each of the different industries that operate in the high seas is managed by a completely different UN body. And until recently, there's been very little communication between those different bodies about how that's being done. And often it's the case when they're actually considering very similar things from my perspective. So, for example, the International Seabed Authority, who are responsible for the licensing of deep sea mining exploration, and also the protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of deep sea mining, are currently looking at implementing regional management plans for areas of the high seas that have been licensed for exploration of mining. And those regional management plans consist of designating what they like to call areas of particular environmental interest, so APEIs. As Lucy said, there's a huge number of acronyms in this field. But to you and I, they're a type of MPA, basically. And so they're looking to put in place MPA networks as part of their regional environmental management plans. Now, at the same time, you have organisations like the Regional Fisheries Management Organisations, called RFMOs, who are responsible for managing fishing in different parts of the high seas. And they are looking at protecting things like vulnerable marine ecosystems on the seabed from the harmful impacts of trawling, bottom trawling. So they are creating closed areas, which is another type of MPA. And, you know, these two processes do not speak to each other at all. And at the same time, you've got the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat, the CBD, who are looking at identifying areas of ecological and biological significance, also called EBSAs, which are, again, a type of MPA, although they have no management on them. And again, they're not involved in that conversation either. So you've got these different organisations all looking at putting in place types of MPA and not communicating with one another. And it hasn't happened yet, although that's more luck than anything else, is you could, at the moment, end up in a position where an area of the high seas is closed to bottom trawling to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems. And that same area is subsequently licensed for mining activities. So this is exactly the problem with the system that we have at the moment. But I mean, apart from all of that, there's another really serious problem that I don't know if we want to go into too much today, but I think it's really important to highlight, is that even if we solve the management issues, even if everything we hope happens and we get a sensible system of governance, you then actually are faced with managing human activities, and that involves taking decisions about what you are going to allow and not going to allow, or where you're going to allow things to go on. And that involves an understanding of the impacts of those activities on the biology, on the ecology, how that biology and ecology will respond to those impacts, how, well, firstly, what are those organisms doing on the seabed? What are the services they're providing, and how are those services going to be impacted? And how's that then going to affect society? So who are going to be the winners and the losers when you're making any kinds of decision around how the ocean is used, such that you can make a good choice about sustainable use? And at the heart of that sort of decision-making process is a fundamental understanding of the biology and ecology of the organisms that live in the deep sea and of the whole deep sea ecosystem. What you have, where it is, what it does, how resistant is it to human activities, how quickly does it recover, so that you can make choices about how you're going to use the ocean. And I only have one slide to show, but I think it's an important one to show. So I am going to share my screen, I have decided at this point, and show you my one slide. I actually have two, but I'm going to skip this one. I don't want to show you this one. Okay, this is the slide I want to show you. So this is an extract from the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, which is a database that holds all the data that's been submitted to it on species data from the deep sea environment. So this is just the deep sea data. It is pelagic as well as benthic, but it is just deep sea data. And what you can see is that there are huge parts of the world, of the global ocean, that we have pretty much no data for. So you'll always hear people saying, you scientists, you always want more data. But actually in parts of the deep sea, I would argue what we need is some data. It's not, you're not dealing with the system that you're dealing with in shallow water. There are parts of the ocean for which we have no data. And just to highlight this, these are the areas that are currently licensed for deep sea mining exploration. And I just want you to take in how little data there are from these places. So lack of data and understanding of deep sea ecosystems is a fundamental problem to our ability to sustainably manage it. And I will finish there.
Kerry, thank you so much. Yes, super valuable points and beautifully made. I think that image you showed on your screen at the end just really highlighted where some of those challenges are. And yes, I'm dying to ask you a question about that later. But now let's move on to the wonderful Jessica Battle. She's a senior expert in global ocean policy and governance at WWF. So she leads the deep sea bed mining initiative at WWF. She's also an extremely highly experienced program manager and strategic thinker, with extensive high-level policy advocacy and communications experience. So she's passionate about thinking about sort of short-term to people-centered and thinking about trying to get that into long-term integrated management. So very interesting what Kerry was saying about we need to manage people's activities. You know, we often think about managing an ocean, but actually we need to manage the activities, therefore managing the people. So really delighted to introduce Jessica. She's currently working on a campaign for a moratorium on deep sea mining. Also on SDG 14 implementation, that's an SDG Sustainable Development Goal on the ocean, and promoting the sustainable blue economy. So Jessica, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and also thank you, Kerry, for making such interesting and important points. I have some slides as well, so instead of you looking at me and my attic, I'm going to share my screen as well. If I can manage to do that, which shouldn't be too much of a problem. There we go. And voila. Yeah, so this, I'm really delighted to be here as a representative of civil society or NGOs working alongside governments and scientists on the New Deal for the Ocean, the BBNJ Ocean Treaty. I will try to not use acronyms too much, but I'm really grateful that some of them have already been explained. So I will focus mostly on marine protected areas, because marine protected areas is one of the legal gaps that this treaty will need to fill. And I also know that Alan is going to highlight some of the structures later. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but more around the sort of the focus on biodiversity. But first of all, just wanted to give you a few facts. The ocean is very important for the world, for many people, both of course people living along the coastlines, in particular in developing countries, but also for all of us. Sylvia Earle, who's one of many of our heroes, her deepness, she always says, every second breath that you take is coming from the ocean. It's a quite powerful fact, I think. if you look at economics, we made a study a few years ago, it was in 2015, where we looked at what the ocean provides in terms of sort of ecosystem services, so not the oil and gas that comes from the seabed, or the minerals that might at some point, if seabed mining begins, come from the seabed, but living resources. And the estimation was it's the seventh largest economy if you compare it to states. So it's quite a, you know, it's an important area of the world that we should not take for granted. And there is so much that we are doing and using of the ocean, and we are doing it more and more intensively. And the interconnectedness between what we are doing on land, including what we are eating, of course, and what we are consuming in all kinds of other ways, and the effects it has on the ocean ecosystems, both the deep sea, but also, of course, on the more surface areas where we get most of the fish from still, even though, as you can see, a lot of fish populations, for example, are plummeting, and this is a real problem in fisheries management. And we also, of course, plastic is one of those topics that a lot of people get very passionate about, and it's a huge problem. It's a totally land-based problem. Of course, some plastic comes from fishing vessels, but there's a very small amount compared to what we manage to release into our rivers and systems, and that end up in the sea. So we need to do something about it, and the ocean treaty is obviously not going to solve all of those problems, but because the high seas is basically half the planet, it would help us to get better management arrangements for the activities on the high seas, but also we are hoping that it will foster a better understanding about how we need to manage all of our activities that have an impact also on the high seas. So even activities that are happening within national jurisdiction, such as fishing, but also polluting activities, need to be better managed and our impacts reduced because the oceans are so interconnected. I wanted to pick up on a point that was made before also about that some states, that, you know, there are various groupings of states that are involved in the negotiations. Of course, you have the coastal and the island states, but we also have landlocked states, and we have the people who are from, you know, various groupings of peoples in these states. Some of them much more dependent upon the ocean for their livelihoods every day, and who also might have traditional knowledge and traditional ties to the ocean that we in Europe have lost, but that, for example, are very important in the Pacific. And the high seas actually belong to all of us. The Law of the Sea Convention has made that clear. It's a responsibility as well as a right. The right seems to be more exercised when it comes to the high seas, the right to access the high seas, the right to extract resources from the high seas, than the responsibility we have to protect and manage it for the future. But I think it is important, and this is something we're really trying to do as civil society when we're advocating for what the treaty needs to include. It also belongs to future generations, of course. The ocean creatures, the ocean life and currents know no boundaries, and despite that, of course, we humans have put lines on the map and like to talk about these boundaries. But when it comes to ocean management, again, the integration between the management systems that are used in international waters, the high seas and the seabed, need to be connected to what is going on inside national jurisdiction. That also, of course, is important in a cross-sectoral sense. So between the various users of the ocean, we need to create a bit more order, and this treaty is hopefully helping us to do that. I also have a picture of the Pacific Ocean. And this picture is here because I find that one of the easiest ways of talking about the interlinkages for biodiversity and the various sectors that are involved in ocean use that story is best told through following the route of a migratory species. So we did this work a couple of years ago when we worked with OBIS and we worked with other organizations to find data tracks for various species, which were sort of extrapolated into these colorful tracks on this map of the North Pacific Ocean. But here you can really see that, you know, during a life of a turtle, of a tuna, of a whale shark, they do travel both within and beyond national jurisdiction. So if you are a country, for example, in the Coral Triangle, and you decide that you are interested in whale shark tourism, and as such you're going to manage whale sharks, and so that whale sharks aren't fished and aren't threatened in your area, and those whale sharks will then be moving across the ocean basin during their life cycle, and they will during that time encounter multiple human activities, and if those are not being managed in order to conserve the whale shark and reduce the impact on this whale shark, the country that has invested all this money and resources into the protection of it will lose that revenue. So it's really important to create this integrated management framework. So the opportunity we have is then that this treaty could help us do that. It can look at, it needs to include all the uses of the ocean. Some users, and it's not a secret, don't want their particular use to be covered by this treaty. I think a case in point is cable laying. The cable layers are always at the UN and saying that don't touch us. But we feel that all users need to be covered by the treaty, because all users have an impact on biodiversity, or at least need to collaborate with others so that they reduce conflicts between each other as well. And we also think that it is important enough for biodiversity in itself to be regarded as a use of the ocean. And this might sound a bit funny, but the protection of marine biodiversity, so of species and of habitats, is important because it in itself, of course, but also because it actually, this biodiversity does have economic advantages for many states and communities. And as such, we do feel that that needs to be almost like, you know, treated like a sector. And another important thing is, you know, we don't know what's coming around the corner. Today we have these users and these sectors. Tomorrow we might have offshore wind farms, we might have offshore aquaculture, and there are all kinds of plans. You know, some are wacky, but I think, you know, seabed mining was regarded as pretty wacky, you know, 40 years ago, and today there is a lot of plans on potentially opening up the seabed for seabed mining. So the treaty really needs to be open to all of this. The last thing I just want to make in my presentation, because I do think we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers, and that's probably more interesting, is that I think that the main need we have right now, as Lucy said in your introduction, is this has been going on for, you know, since 2004. It's only, of course, the last couple of years that we've been in a negotiation session at the UN, and this is what it looks like. No windows. Everybody is focused on what others are saying, of course, and it is we are in here for hours and hours, and these negotiations. If there's not more political will instilled in the negotiations, I do not think that we're going to get what the ocean and our children need for the future. So I would think that is the most important element at the moment. There's reasonably good progress on the various parts, but without the political will, we're going to have trouble, you know, affording the ocean and the biodiversity what it needs out of this treaty. I think I'll finish with that, and I hope there will be lots of questions and interest. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you so much. Again, some really powerful visuals. And I think, yeah, you mentioned there specifically about the services, and those are, you know, those ideas of the benefit that the deep ocean that we never might see, actually what that provides for us every day is something that we probably don't necessarily think about. And it's interesting, isn't it? If we were talking about negotiations of how to protect a charismatic mammal, then there might be some more discussions or different types of discussions going on. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it, to have those thoughts. How does the ocean benefit us, and do people know really what it can do? So now is my absolute pleasure to welcome back a graduate from Oxford. He graduated with first class honours from the University of Oxford after studying economics and statistics. This is Alan Simcoe. Alan was private secretary to successive UK prime ministers between 1969 and 1972, and then he worked in the UK Department of the Environment. In 1991, he was asked to set up a new division to coordinate the UK policy on the marine environment, and was chairman of OSPAR Commission, which is protection for the marine environment in the Northeast Atlantic. In 1999, he chaired the informal negotiations at the UN Commission on Sustainable Development on the Oceans, and this resulted in the establishment of the UN Informal Consultative Process on the Ocean and the Law of the Sea. And then he was appointed co-chairperson for its 3 years. 2001 to 2006, he was executive secretary of OSPAR and then retired. Gosh, not surprised. That's a lot of stuff, Alan. I'm delighted that you could be with us today to share your experience in these processes. But he didn't stop, because he's been involved with the UN regular process for ocean assessment, and was joint coordinator of the group for experts of this process in 2009 to 2015. And this is the world assessment for the first time. He's also coordinating the second world ocean assessment, and I'm sure was going to be presenting into the General Assembly this year, but maybe that has also been delayed. So Alan, delighted that you're with us, and please share your thoughts.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you for including me. It makes me sound a terrible bureaucrat, I'm afraid, but that is perhaps part of the task, to manage the bureaucracy. I've produced a short presentation. It's not as pretty as the ones that you have seen just now, but I think it may help focus my presentation and help your understanding. What I want to start with is the question of managing the ocean. We can't manage the ocean. It's vast, dynamic, and integrated. Every bit of the ocean is connected to every other bit. You've got some inland seas like the Caspian, but basically everything is connected. What we can manage are the human activities, and you've already mentioned those. But the problem is that the activities that affect the ocean take place all over the planet. The best example is waste disposal, and particularly plastic waste disposal, which is causing a worldwide problem of this kind. But there are also others, various chemical emissions, volatile organic compounds that affect the water and which produce disease and so on. So you have to think in terms of managing all human activities practically. And what we need to do is to try and build the ocean dimension into general decision making. That may sound a very limited goal, but it's, I think, very difficult to achieve. You've seen the list that Jessica showed of the various things that we need to manage. There are plenty of them, and they all need different approaches, and most of them, and many of them, are tied into onshore activities. All the land-based activities that produce pollution have to be thought about. coastal development, the way we build hotels along beaches where turtles breed and so on, it all needs to be brought in. Even scientific research needs to be brought in, because at the moment, the general view is that scientific research is probably the major threat to the hydrothermal vent communities, which were discovered 30 odd years ago, and which represent the only life form on the planet that's not dependent on sunshine, and which are therefore scientifically fascinating, but where research is a threat to them. We've got umpteen instruments to deal with these problems. UNCLOS is the foundation. It's often referred to as the constitution of the ocean. It took from 1958 to 1982 to negotiate, and then it took from 1982 to 1995 to get it into force. And there are still countries that do not subscribe to it. The most significant ones are the United States, where the Senate has never been persuaded to approve ratification. However, that's perhaps less of a problem, since the United States State Department takes the view that UNCLOS is more or less a codification of customary international law. So they're happy with that. It's just that they can't get the Senate to approve it. Turkey, on the other hand, doesn't think that UNCLOS gives them sufficient control over the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, and that will not accept anything that is based on UNCLOS. Peru and Chile feel that what UNCLOS says about the exclusive economic zone that coastal states are allowed is not strong enough. They the 200 miles that UNCLOS provides, 200 nautical miles that UNCLOS provides, they regard as inadequate, and they want 2,000. So there are problems even with the basic foundation. The 18 regional seas programs are important. Many of these work with UNEP. Some of them, like OSPAR, for the Northeast Atlantic, are independent and predate UNEP. These can be very important because they deal with practical problems such as shipping disasters. They deal with dumping at sea, which they try to control. Some try to deal with land-based pollution, and some, like OSPAR, are interested in trying to safeguard the marine environment generally, including the high seas. The OSPAR maritime area extends out to the southern tip of Greenland and then south of the latitude of the Straits of Gibraltar, which is a large slice of the Atlantic. And OSPAR has, in 2003, started the idea of marine protected areas on the high seas. Their idea was, and is, that OSPAR, the 15 OSPAR states and the European Union, which is also a member, should work together in the various international bodies that are relevant to do something about protecting the marine area. And there are now some marine protected areas to which that is being applied on the high seas. You then have 40 or so regional fisheries management bodies, which are, again, some of them under the umbrella of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, some independent. You then have I see I have written this down wrongly, the International Maritime Organization, IMO, which is the global body for shipping, and which, in spite of its problems with the voting rights being largely concentrated in the hands of the open registers, such as Belize and Bahamas and Panama and Liberia, is actually making real progress. You have the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, which is the body dealing with ocean science, and you have the International Seabed Authority, and there are other international bodies involved. have various things that are in progress. The regular process for the global reporting and assessment of the state of the marine environment, including socio-economic aspects, which is what I've been coordinating for the past 12 years, can perhaps be shortened to the regular process for world ocean assessments. As you've been told, we produced the first, which was a baseline survey in 2015, and we're now working on the next one. The BBNJ instrument you've heard a lot about, but there are also important things like the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which is doing much to stop their entry into the ocean, along with the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which is equally important. And then you have other bodies of a less binding nature, of which the Global Programme of Action is an important one, because it tries to encourage states to pull together nationally programs for protecting the marine environment from land-based activities, and then to report on what they're doing and open themselves to scrutiny. What we do? Well, we certainly need to improve the regional seas programs. Some, like the Nairobi Convention, are limited to the EEZs of the member states. We need to get all of them to take an interest in the high seas. We need to improve the regional fisheries management bodies, which are basically the high seas fisheries management. Many of those still do not have the protection and conservation of biodiversity as a goal. They're mainly concerned with fisheries profits, and a lot of work needs to be done there. We need to improve enforcement. There are various international agreements, for instance, the memorandums of understanding on port state control of shipping, which is crucial because you can only really get a lever over shipping when the ship's in port, and therefore getting the port states to use their legitimate powers to control that, and incidentally such things as the social condition of seafarers is important. We now have a port state control instrument on fisheries. This is very recent and is only slowly coming into force, but it is a very good way of controlling high seas fisheries by managing the way in which the fishers can sell their catches. But there are problems there. Taiwan, for instance, is a major problem because not merely is it not allowed to be part of the international community, since China, the People's Republic of China, regards it as part of their territory, but also the Taiwanese government doesn't itself have much control over the Taiwanese fishing fleet. And then we need to improve management structures and even more skills, training people to understand all this and to have the skills necessary to implement the instruments I've been talking about. We also need better scientific understanding. World Ocean Assessment 1 tried to give an overview of that, but that merely emphasizes what the map that you were shown demonstrates, which is there are large areas where we don't know. But above all, we need to improve integration and, I would add, ocean literacy. Integration because within national governments, departments don't talk to each other. I spent 10 years trying to get an integrated UK policy on the marine environment, and I know how difficult it is. And in many countries, nobody is making that effort. Ocean literacy is also important because that's getting the general public to understand what the importance of the oceans and how to improve their status. I hope that is not too long and gives you some idea of the organizational structure against which this discussion has to happen. Thank you very much.
Alan, thank you so much for those wise words. I think the point you made around this connectedness of the ocean, but actually there are dispersed challenges, and how do we put in a framework that deals with that is so important and really key to this process. And I also loved your details about all the different examples, and that really helped bring it alive, because there's a lot of acronyms and lots of processes that are involved. And I think for me, that's what came out of all of the speakers today, was that sort of understanding of how complex the government structure is right now, that governance, and what that siloing has been like, and actually how it has resulted in this sort of disjointed situation of these sort of organizations, and trying to ensure that there is a healthy ocean for future generations. So I do encourage everyone to put your questions in the chat. I see that we have some right now. We're just going to go ahead with a few questions that came in before the talk. So if all of the panelists can put their videos back on, thank you. And we're just going to go for some questions. I'm going to address these to each of the panelists, but of course, if anyone else on the panel who I wasn't addressing feels the need, then just wave at me as well, okay? Because it's great to get that different perspective. So Kerry, I'm going to start with you. So you showed us that amazing map with so many blanks, and we've got really patchy and really sparse data. So how do you think that we can monitor the high seas effectively, monitor and even collect data where it currently isn't? What do we need to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, the obvious thing is to collect more data, but I mean, part of the problem with the way in which we've done deep sea science in the past is that it tends to be very disconnected. That's a word that comes up a lot. And so you have individual projects working on their bit that they're interested in. And so there's no kind of coherent effort, I suppose, to make sure things are being covered. And that's fine, that's the nature of science. But we also have the problem that traditionally deep sea science is carried out by usually economically developed nations, particularly Northern Hemisphere nations. And this has led to a significant bias in the data that we have. And you can see that really clearly on the map I showed. You know, the North Atlantic, North Pacific, there's fair amount of data. Off of New Zealand and Australia, there's also quite a lot of data. But the South Atlantic, the South Pacific, Southern Indian Ocean, really, really big data gaps. And that's kind of partly, you know, at least partly down to the inequalities in access to this environment and the ability, or yeah, I mean, it's the infrastructure really to carry out science in these areas. So, you know, we have a lot to do beyond just collecting more data. We have to think about, you know, where are those data gaps, and how can we get the world to coordinate to fill those data gaps, and also then to broaden that scientific research base to other nations and get more people engaged in deep sea scientific research. In the interim, though, I think you know, we have to start looking at reliance on models and modeling capabilities. So we need to take the understanding that we have of the deep sea areas that we do know something about, and we, you know, the North Atlantic particularly, we know quite a lot about. And we have to use that knowledge and try to apply it to new areas. And we can do that through various modelling approaches. And I think that's something that's going to become increasingly important over the next 10 years, is trying to use modelling approaches to fill those data gaps, such that we have at least some information on which to base those sustainable management decisions and that process about how we manage our activities, and what we allow to go on where.
Kerry, thank you for that really detailed answer. Yeah, I mean, you bring up so many really important points, and you and I, you know, struggle this, don't we? We look at this bias in data and just like, well, you know, what can we say? How can it help us interpret what's out there? And it's really challenging. So thank you for your thoughts on that. Jessica, we're going to come to you now, if that's okay. And I've got a question here around sort of what scale do you think?
Could I just add something to that?
Of course, Alan, please.
I think there's an aspect there that needs to be mentioned, which is Argos. This is the research program, which is again largely funded by developed countries, the US, UK, France, Germany, and so on, but which releases floats that the 3,000 or so a year, I think is the figure, which are going round the world, floating, and every so often surfacing and broadcasting back to satellites the data they've collected. This started in 2003 and has transformed our understanding of the chemistry and physics of the ocean, because we now have so much more data there. At the moment, the Argos floats are being developed so that they will have some more biological equipment. And my understanding is certainly that over the next 10 years, next 15 years, we should see as big a transformation in our understanding, certainly of plankton and other small creatures, comparable to the transformation that we've had over the past 15 years from physics and chemistry. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, no, that's a really good point and an incredibly important program, and actually very easy to deploy those Argo floats. Deploy them on expeditions, and you don't need any expertise to do that. I was talking with some of the people about it the other day on a call, so thank you for mentioning that.
But you have problems. For instance, Argentina regards the Argos floats as invading their sovereignty because they're capable of floating into their EEZ. And that gives rise, Argentina regards that as being improper, and therefore using it as a lever in the BBNJ negotiations.
That's an interesting take, isn't it? Gosh, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so Jessica, we're going to come to you now, and really interested in trying to understand from you, what do you think the scale should be around ocean governance?
Well, it kind of comes back to the these patterns of migratory species, but more than that, if you look at how the ocean ecosystems are functioning, they function on a sort of a super regional scale very often, and also the areas where states most naturally collaborate around the oceans is around an ocean basin, both the coastal states, but also those states that then come into that region to fish, for example, or indeed conduct marine scientific research as well. So both for an ecological and for more of a political reason, it seems to us that organizing the management and in particular the area-based management and collaboration structures that could be set up through this treaty. And I'm not talking about something monstrous and big, but a way for states to have these conversations, to collaborate around which areas are important for biodiversity to conserve, where are the hotspots, from our perspective seems to be best done at that regional scale. And we've been thinking quite a lot about this and proposing that it could be done at the sort of 7 seas scale, you know, the 7 ocean basin scales, if you wish. So we're not looking at small areas here. I think another thing which is really important is that these arrangements, whatever they might be, need to be open to all states. So it's not only for those states actually who have a skin in the game in terms of, you know, they go fishing there. It might be other states who, for other reasons, have an interest in healthy oceans, and that could be a state that the country I live in is landlocked state, Switzerland. Switzerland gives a lot of development money and have big development programs in coastal states in various parts of the world. That could be a reason for getting involved in ensuring sustainable use and protection of these areas. So that I think would be a good way to find those areas of collaboration. There's some resistance to it from some quarters. from other quarters, it seems to be gaining some traction. I was wondering whether I could just comment on OSPAR, because OSPAR is a really interesting example in terms of regional collaboration. OSPAR is an example that is very often put out in the negotiations as a, as Alan mentioned, a way of establishing high seas marine protected areas. But these high seas marine protected areas are not regarded as, under international law as valid by states like Argentina, because OSPAR is not open to states that are not part of the the wider basin of water running into that region and the coastal states. Switzerland is a party to the OSPAR Convention, and so are all the coastal states around Switzerland because of the connection with I guess the Rhine. But those MPAs hold no standing in the eyes of some law of the sea parties.
Jessica, thank you. Anyone else like to comment? Helen or Kerry?
Well, certainly when we started the idea of the high seas marine protected areas in OSPAR in 2003, and I actually wrote the document that started them, we knew that countries like Argentina would not accept the idea, but the purpose was to try to get an arrangement whereby the OSPAR countries collectively would operate in whatever international body was needed in order to achieve protection for that, so that getting the OSPAR countries to work together in the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission was important and has resulted in controls over fisheries in the Northeast Atlantic. And the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission is open to any country that wants to fish in there. I think at one stage New Zealand was, if not a member, then thinking of becoming a member, because they wanted to come and fish in the Northeast Atlantic. So it is a way of getting some weight behind the idea that certain areas need to be protected. The question is whether you can develop these any further. The crucial ones, I think, are probably fisheries and seabed mining, but there are also, and possibly scientific investigation. Cable laying is more difficult because you would probably need to change UNCLOS significantly in relation to cable laying before you started being able to control where the cables went on high seas. But then you do have a much more great control over where cables can come ashore. And that can give you leverage over the laying of cables, because you can say, we're not going to let you come ashore unless you do this, that, or the other when you're laying it on the high seas. And there are certainly some cases where cables have been laid and are now useless because the country where they wanted to come ashore was not prepared to allow them to do so. So there are complicated interactions between different things that are possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So I've got a question here from one of the attendees tonight. And Alan, I'm actually going to address this to you initially, but obviously would be delighted to hear from Jessica and Kerry after. So interconnectedness has been a theme highlighted by all the panelists. What do you think could be done to improve the connection between the different sectors and the organisations in managing the ocean?
Well, the crucial thing is to do it at the national level to start with. It's no use having the representatives of the Ministry of Fisheries flatly contradicting the Ministry of the Environment. I mean, that has happened with Iceland in the setting up of the global ocean assessment. We were held up for 2 or 3 years because the Icelandic Ministry of Fisheries was not happy with what the Icelandic Ministry of the Environment was doing. So if you don't start at the national level, you won't get anywhere. The problem is that many countries, the ministries responsible for the marine environment are not strong ministries. They're not ones that have got a lot of political clout. While I was trying to coordinate UK marine environment policy, I was in the happy position that the then Department of the Environment was quite a significant government department. At one stage, we had the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, as our Secretary of State, and that gave certainly a considerable leverage. I reckon that I only got the UN informal consultative process agreed by the UK government because the Foreign Secretary wasn't prepared to take on John Prescott because the Foreign Office officials were definitely not very happy with what I was wanting to do. So it depends very much on the status of the ministries involved. In the Netherlands, the Ministry of Transport and Water is crucial, and they are very important because they're what keep the Netherlands from flooding, apart from anything else. So it is a powerful ministry. Go to Italy, and the Ministry of the Environment is not a significant player, and trying to get the Italians on board can be quite difficult. And that is even more the case as you go into more developing countries where environment is regarded as something to be thought about when you've solved all the other problems, rather than being something that you need to solve in order to solve the other problems. The crucial thing is getting the national level to work together. Once you've got that, you can then start trying to get the international bodies to work rather better.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. Jessica, have you got anything? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. I actually want to pick up on a point that I totally agree, obviously, with what Alan said. But I want to pick up on a point that you mentioned, Alan, in your presentation, which is ocean literacy. Because I do think that the ocean is sort of the neglected area of the planet when it comes to our understanding, and fishy, slimy things are not so easy to connect to as cuddly animals or amazing creatures that we can sort of see more in habitats that we are more used to seeing or can be fascinated by. Not everybody can have access either to the wonderful BBC Blue Planet and other things to even get that amazing experience. So I think that's really important, a really important point. And I think that's really something which I would encourage scientists to do more of. The other part is this push to ensure that what is sometimes called the blue growth agenda or the blue economy agenda is actually a sustainable practice. They'll be looking at the blue economy, what the ocean economy can yield within a sustainability framework. And I think that's also somewhere where we all who care about the ocean need to work with those who can help us quantify those values, as we try to do with this report we issued in 2015 on the 7th largest economy in the world, etc. But to really make those connections. And again, the question was interconnectedness. Yes, the interconnectedness is there also from, in the economic sense and the social sense. And so that is something that needs to come through a lot more. And I think that would also help to, as you were saying, Alan, to bring up the environment from being this sort of second, stepchild into the family of ministries that actually do work with those sectors that are regarded as being economically interesting.
If I may, could I just draw everyone's attention to the initiative that the Norwegian Prime Minister launched 3 years ago now at one of the Davos World Economic Forum meetings. Norway has been working very hard for the past 2.5 years to try to develop the idea that we need much more emphasis on the blue economy and much more investment in it. They've been exploring how to mobilize the investment that's needed. They set up an expert group of which they asked me to be a member. But significantly, the expert group is publishing a series of blue papers, they're called, under the aegis of a group of states that have got together. There are 15 of them, from Indonesia to Chile, from Norway to South Africa and New Zealand, that are trying to push the agenda of how to get the blue economy developed in a sustainable way. There should have been a UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon in June, at which this whole project was due to be launched. This is now, I think, going probably to happen in June 2021, if circumstances allow. And that should be a major input. But if you're interested in this field, it's important to look at what the Norwegian government is doing with its high-level forum on the blue economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I've just put in a link there about the blue papers, and yeah, all of them have now been published. I think 16 in total. Kerry, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, I've got another question for you.
No, I think they've. I think Alan and Jessica have said yeah, a lot of really good stuff on this question.
Great. So as a question here, I'm thinking some really key aspects. You know, we've spoken about connectivity and the ocean is connected, but actually how connected are deep sea ecosystems? And I think, yeah, the question here is sort of, so in other words, is it possible to sacrifice some areas to an activity while you can conserve the rest of the ecosystem on a larger scale? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a difficult one to answer. So, and again, it comes down to lack of data. The fact is, so we know something about the connectivity of the deep sea. We know that some, as within shallow water, some organisms, some populations are reasonably well connected, it seems, over quite vast distances, others not so. But one thing we do know is that rarity is common in the deep sea. So whenever you go out and sample the deep sea and you're looking at the species that you're finding, the tails in terms of, you know, numbers of species and an abundance of those species, those tails are really, really long. So you have quite a number of what appear to be quite common species on the face of it, but I'll come back to that. And then you have loads and loads of rares that you only ever see once in your area. And I think what we haven't really bottomed out is if these things really are rare, or is it just they're so dispersed, they're so not, what's the opposite of dense? They're
scattered.
Thank you. They're so scattered across such large areas. So their populations are very low density, but over great areas, that we have lots of these things that appear to be rare. And we don't actually have the answer to that question at the moment. And then we've also got the added challenge that sometimes things that appear common turn out, when you look at their genetics, to in fact be not the same species at all. But so again, you know, what you perceive as an organism having a very large distribution, very wide distribution, actually turns out to not be the case. And so my point is that it's really difficult to get a good handle on connectivity. in terms of population connectivity, at least, because there's still so many questions. In terms of ecosystems, though, in different ecosystems relying on other systems, so for example, in shallow water, things like mangroves and coral reefs are intimately connected systems. Again, there certainly are those things, but there's still, again, I hate to keep coming back to it, but there are still just huge data gaps. We suspect there are lots of examples of those things, but we are lacking the information to show it. I think it is fair to say, though, that it may entirely be possible to exploit areas of the deep sea and leave other areas aside. But at the moment, we can't confidently say how that would operate. We can't confidently say that, you can destroy this much habitat, and as long as you leave that much alone, it'll all still function. We can't say that at the moment because we don't have the information. So that's the challenge.
Kerry, thank you. And it always brings me back to something I think about when we're at sea. If we can see something, we know it's present. But if we don't see it, we don't know it's not present. And that's always really challenging. If we think about the number of us who are lucky enough to go to sea and to collect these type of data, and then think about how vast the ocean is. I think you make a really good point about actually, yeah, it is one big ocean, but, and it's always that but, isn't it? How much do we need to know? And I think your point on those models and how much can we learn from that modeling, from what we might expect using some of the environmental variables, which are maybe a little better understood than some of the biological patterns. That sounds like something, yeah, that we can be working on the rest of our careers.
Could I also stress that, as well as being connected, the ocean is dynamic. It's continually changing. I mean, one of the things that has always impressed me is the continuous plankton survey, which I'm sure you and Jessica and Kerry know more about than I do. For now 70 years, we've been studying the plankton distributions in the North Atlantic and the North Sea. And we have records that show that the mix of plankton is changing quite significantly over time. There are sort of sine waves over double decades, 15, 20 years of change in what are the dominant plankton. There are now 9 continuous plankton surveys around the world, but they are nothing like what is needed to understand what is happening to the plankton. And the basis of the plankton is quite important because they are obviously the bottom of the food chain, and they can affect the way in which the higher levels of the food web alter. So we need to know in some way how things that we're doing, possibly on land, are we making land-based inputs that are affecting the plankton? We just don't know at the moment, and we need much more. It's not just what you can see, it's what you need a microscope to see as well, and the change. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Really important point. So we've got another question now. And this one kind of goes back to this idea of equity, really thinking about what is the best way to integrate communities who are traditionally marginalized in these kinds of discussions, and how do we help them be part of the decision making about the ocean? And then the questioner goes on to saying, particularly as some of these societies may be the ones that are affected most by the issues, such things as in stock depletion due to overfishing. So I don't know who might have an idea about that. Maybe Jessica?
Yeah, thanks. I can start. Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I think there's several things here. One is if we coming back into the discussions around the Ocean Treaty, the BBNJ Treaty a little bit. there are discussions about how to incorporate traditional knowledge in the decision-making processes, which I think is very important. How exactly that will be incorporated, I am not a lawyer, so I cannot tell you that, but I think it is a really important point. Traditional users of the ocean do have a lot of knowledge about how the ocean can be managed. There are examples, for example, in the Pacific, where the Pacific communities for many years, decades, even hundreds of years, have been closing off certain areas in order to let fisheries improve there, and then coming back in and fishing there. And it's just part of their dynamic use of the ocean. And I think also, to Alan's point, that they know a lot about the dynamic nature of the ocean, and that these boundaries that we might put on the ocean, which belongs, that this part belongs to you, this part belongs to me, is not how it works in the ocean. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from them, and that needs to be incorporated. But then the other part is the capacity building and transfer technology part of the agreement really needs to also include the provisions that enable societies, states and communities to contribute and to share knowledge and to use knowledge in this regard. And so, yeah, I think those would be my point, and I'd be keen to hear others as well. Thanks.
Kerry, I know that you've had some work in this area. Do you have a comment? Oh,
yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah. Yeah, I think it is something that I think we struggle with in the scientific community. That traditional knowledge, particularly, and local and indigenous knowledge as well, and how to I wouldn't say incorporate it, because it's a different knowledge system, but how to consider it fully in the sort of design of the science and the questions that we're asking. And I think we, honestly say we've got a fair bit to do on that in thinking about how we do that. But in terms of the equity question, though, I mentioned it earlier that deep sea science is hugely dominated by particular nations, and I would really like to see changes to that. And I know you've gone to great efforts, particularly to just try to make it a bit fairer, really, and work with people, scientists in nations that haven't traditionally either been able or haven't perhaps just had that field open to them to get into deep sea science. And so the scientific community, I think, has a huge role to play in actively forming new partnerships and co-designing research programs in regions. And it's always those regions where we're lacking data as well. To try to move deep sea science forward, frankly.
Thank you, Kerry. Alan, did you have something?
There are, I think, about 3 points I'd like to make. First, there are various initiatives that are important. Again, Norway is significant because it has a marine research vessel, the Fridtjof Nansen, which it puts at the disposal of African states, both on East Africa and West Africa, to help them get better grasp of their fish stock evaluation and so on, and to train their scientists. Belgium likewise has passed on its marine research vessel to Kenya, and that is now operating very successfully in the Western Indian Ocean. So there are initiatives, we need more of them, and the problem is to find the resources for them. Norway is fortunate that it has its sovereign wealth fund, and they see an important part of that as going into improving the management of the marine environment. Secondly, the problem of incorporating traditional knowledge, I think, is probably more significant for national governments. There are not that many traditional activities that go out more than 200 nautical miles from the coast. Certainly there are in the Pacific, where you have the long-range shipping, sailing activities of which kept Samoa and Tahiti and Hawaii in touch over many centuries. But most of the knowledge about the fish stocks and the way in which the ocean works tend to be rather more coastal. So that is a limit on what there is to be incorporated in relation to the deep ocean. And then thirdly, you do definitely have to think about very carefully the way in which you can have unintended side effects of worthy international agreements. The most obvious example is the International Whaling Convention. They have achieved a moratorium on whaling generally, but this has had a very severe impact on certain tribes of Native Americans in Washington and Oregon, who regarded their whaling activities rather like the traditional whaling of the Faroese, and have found that they have been deprived of what they regarded as a major part of their traditional way of life, the occasional catching of a whale in rowing boats. They've now been at it for, I think, 14 years with the US authorities, trying to get permission to restart their whaling, which they regard as being an integral part of their way of life. And they see the very justifiable International Whaling Commission's moratorium as a threat to that way of life. So you have to be careful about side winds from worthy agreements. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So I realise now we've only got 4 minutes left. I can't believe an hour and a half has gone through so quickly. So I think I would just like to ask all of the panelists just for 1 minute's worth, so just 2 sentences, on what would you like your take-home message to be today? What do you want everyone who is listening today as an attendee to go and back and think about? And I think for me, and I'll just give everyone a little bit of a chance to think about it, my 1 sentence is going to be, the ocean is there for all of us now and for the future. So we need to ensure we've got a governance framework that allows that to make sure that we're all successful equitably. Kerry.
I'd finish with a hopeful message. We've made significant progress. It takes good people, and that's lawyers and social scientists and ecologists and a whole range of disciplines to really move us forward. And so I think, the next 10 years are going to see us making even greater moves forward in this area.
Brilliant, thank you. Jessica.
Yes, I will follow on, I think, from Kerry. I think that the world is waking up to the fact that the ocean is important. I think that the Sustainable Development Goals and the integration that they are bringing between social, environmental and economic factors are a really important part of this. And so I am hopeful for better ocean governance and management. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And Alan.
Can I convert my 2 sentences into a commercial? I would encourage everyone to go and have a look at this, the first World Ocean Assessment. You can find it on un.org/regular process. The full text is there and you can have a look at it. The next assessment will be out in February, and I would encourage everyone to have a look at that. In the second one, we're trying to show how much has changed in the last 5 years, and there are some good messages and, not surprisingly, some very bad messages. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I just want to say one more thanks to all of our panelists today. You've been able to bring a unique perspective from all your different backgrounds to this challenge that, of course, is currently ongoing. And, I think the diversity of views and your diversity of expertise and experiences has really provided such a rich opportunity for us to be able to listen and hear your views today. I know we've got other questions, which I'm really sorry we haven't been able to get through. But please, if the organisers could keep the chat and the questions, we can get those potentially answered if the panelists are interested. And yeah, it just leaves me to say thank you, everyone, for wonderful contributions, for being with us today, and have a good rest of your day and rest of your week. Stay safe, everyone. Bye now.